everything new, but the pulpit is still same, so I'm comfortable with this pulpit. I hope you have found your seat. I haven't found mine. Right, that's why I'm still trying to see which is the best seat. For me, the aircon is a controlling factor. I can't have aircon blowing on me. I know that Brother Mike has found his place. He told me he's written his name on the chair. Right, if you have found yours, write your name there. You can see this next Sunday, easy to find your seat. I know that for most of you, you're happy today, at least for two reasons. I think number one, you realize that church now is a lot nearer to where you are from. Right? So it's probably half the distance for most of us, right, including me. And the church, remember, is heaven on earth. So they are that much nearer to heaven, right, this Sunday. The other reason why you are probably happy this morning is that you don't have to pay toll. But I say only for most of us. So for people like Aaron, that is not true, right? Now he has to pay toll. And I say to him that, well, that is the punishment for voting for BN, right? Anyway, right, I hope most of us are quite settled. And for this morning, instead of looking at our usual series, I'm going to draw your attention to 1 Kings. So you have already heard 1 Kings chapter 6 being read. In fact, you might say that, wow, it is a long chapter. But actually, I'm not considering just one chapter today. We are looking at two chapters. It is 1 Kings chapters 5 and 6. And you see that the reason why we are looking at this is because I feel that here are some reminders for us as we move over here. Now, 1 Kings, in fact, you might say that 1 Kings and 2 Kings have the temple, right, the temple of God as one of his key items, right, key themes in 1 and 2 Kings. In 1 Kings, we have the construction of the temple, and then in 2 Kings, we have the destruction of the temple. Right? I hope we only have construction and no destruction, but that is what the 1st and 2nd Kings are about. And to show you that the 1 Kings chapter 5 and 6 in particular is here we have the focus as the temple construction, right? The temple constructions. And so if you would, please again turn in your Bible to 1 Kings. And you look there in the chapter 6 and verse 9. It says there, so he built the temple and finished it. So Solomon built the temple. And then in verse 14, so Solomon built the temple and finished it. And then in verse 38, the last verse, in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house, that is the temple, was finished in all its details, according to all its plans. And so he was 7 years in building the temple. Right? So it's very clear that this chapter and the one before it, in chapter 5, is about temple constructions. And we know that in the past weeks, since the middle of April until even this very last moment, we have been busy with temple construction, or we say church constructions. And when I read, for example, verses 15 and 16 of chapter 6, where it says here, so he builds the inside wall of the temple with cedar boards. From the floor of the temple to the ceiling, he paneled the inside with wood. He covered the floor of the temple with planks of cypress, and then he built, right, verse 16, the 20 cubit rooms at the rear of the temple, from the floor to the ceiling with cedar boards. So reading these verses reminds me of Elder Kenning and Brother Michael. I can count. As I was reading this text, I can imagine them discussing about the middle partition, about the back room door, right? A back room of this place, and the kind of material to use for different parts of this building. And that is really what we are reading here in a chapter like this. And this is a long chapter. In fact, you should be thankful that this chapter is so short. Imagine, right, if we were to have someone as a secretary to write a record of the temple construction here since middle of April until now. It would be longer than this chapter, right? About the many things that we have done in this place. And so we have already this temple construction here, the platform, the flooring, the lights. In fact, I can remember following or going with other camping to look for the comfortable and beautiful chairs that you are sitting on. Now, a lot of thinking and effort, all right, have gone into choosing these chairs. First from the internet, all right, and he found one, and he was very excited and said, "This is the chair, all right, to get for the church." And then after some consideration, he said, "No, that is not the right chair." All right. He said, "The best way is let's go to the factories." And so we went, all right, to plan. We went to one factory and we were looking at many chairs. All right, this I don't want the manager or what, and he showed us this chair and that chair and trying to recommend to us. All right. And we were not just looking at that. I can see Elder Kendeng here sitting on the chair, and he was just testing both the strength and say whether he can take our weight and the comfort and so on. And I remember he saw one chair and said, "That's it, that is a chair we should get." And so he sat down there, he felt very happy with the chair. Then he decided, no, that's not the chair. Right? He said, "It's too comfortable. Right? We don't want people to sit and sleep right, in the church." You see, a lot of thinking gone into the chair, and finally we went to another factory and we found this chair, right, after again looking at many chairs. And so that is, imagine, right, even writing about chairs will take more than these 38 verses. Alright, so temple construction. And here we must remind ourselves as we look at these chapters, or these 2 chapters about Solomon's temple construction, to remember that the real temple, right, is not the church building. So the last few weeks we have been busy with church building construction, not with church construction. All right, remember the distinction. So the real work is really the church construction. And I believe that although these 2 chapters speak of building construction, the actual building, right, of the temple, but remember that the Old Testament temple foreshadows or points to the church, right, not to the church building. All right, it points to the church. And that is very clear if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3. And that is what Paul is thinking about, right? When he thinks of the temple, he used temple terminology. He used Old Testament pictures here. But here we know what he is clearly talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Alright, and verse 16 and 17, he says here, "Do you not know that you are the temple of God? You are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you." And then he says, "If anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy, which temple you are." Now you see, he is speaking of or using an Old Testament picture here, that of the temple. And very clearly, Paul is thinking of this Old Testament picture. But he's applying to the New Testament people, not to the building. He says it's not this building, but he says which temple you are. You are the temple. And so we the church, or the people of God, we are the temple of God. And so that is the first thing to remember as we study these 2 chapters here, that the Old Testament temple points to the church. The question then is, what can we learn about building God's church from the temple constructions? Or we look at the temple construction in 1 Kings 5 and 6. So what can we learn about church construction? Now here are a few things as by way of reminder for us. Number one, turn back again to 1 Kings. The first thing we must remember is that it is God who builds His church. It is God who builds his church. Now remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 18. He said, I will build my church. I will build my church. Jesus Christ is building his church. Now never therefore say that we are the ones who build the church. Never say that, right? Never say that we are the one who builds the church. Now when we think that we are the protagonists or the main actors in the building of the church, now then we will be proud. And then we will always be thinking, when we build a large church, when the church grows and becomes big, now we begin to congratulate ourselves and say, you see how clever we are. Now we can build a big church. We begin to claim credits for building the largest church in Sunway, Bandar. Now you see, we must never think like that, because it is not us who builds the church. It is Jesus. It is God. Now we can see that in this passage here in 1 Kings. Now there are three things, at least, to underscore this point. It is to remind Solomon that in the building of the temple, it is not Solomon, but it is God. Now number one, we see here in chapter 5. 1 Kings chapter 5 and verse 4. Now we see the first reminder here, the first thing to remind Solomon, it is not you who builds the temple, it is me. Verse 4 of chapter 5 says, but now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor evil occurrence. Now what does this verse tell us about God building the temple? Well, you see here, Solomon says, and now the Lord my God has given me rest. What does that mean, to give Solomon rest? Well, it means this. You see, if you look at chapter 4 and verse 24, it says that, for he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river, from Tipsha even to Gaza, namely over all the kings on this side of the river. And he had peace on every side all around him. Verse 25, and Judah and Israel dwelt safely, each man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan as far as Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. What are these verses saying? Now, these are important verses, you see, to help us understand that God was the one building the temple. In that, during the days of Solomon, God gave that nation peace. That is what he said here, that he had dominion over all the other kings, from then to as far as Beersheba. That means over all the whole region, the whole kingdom, there was rest. Rest, that means there was peace. And then you see that in chapter 5 and verse 4, not only there was rest, it says what? It says that there is neither adversary, or no enemies out there to attack them, and no evil occurrence, no bad tsunami or whatever that occur in the nation. There was peace. But never think that when there is peace in the nation, it is again our effort. Because it clearly says in this verse that it is the Lord my God who has given me peace. It is God in His providence. He has control. He controls all things in such a way that He now gives Solomon that peace in order for him to build the temple. Now we might ask, you see, why didn't David build the temple? Why didn't he build? Now in fact, this is stated as the reason why David did not build the temple. Because if you look in verse 3 of chapter 5, you know how my father David could not build a temple or a house for the name of the Lord, his God, because of the walls which were fought against him on every side, until the Lord put his foes under the sole of his feet. So it's very clear the reason why David could not build a temple is because he was at war. When the nation was not in peace, he was fighting his enemies. And we know that, you see, that when the nation is in such chaos, it is difficult, right, to build a temple. And so that is the first reason. And Solomon understood, therefore it was not luck, right? It was not luck that he enjoys peace, but it is God who gave him that. But then also the second thing we see in chapter 5, to underscore, to remind Solomon that it is God who builds his temple. In verse 7, right? In verse 7. So it was when Hiram heard the words of Solomon that he rejoiced greatly and said, Blessed be the Lord this day, for he has given David a wise son who has over these great people. Now you see what is being stated here. That in verse 7 here, when Hiram was a pagan, all right? He's just a friend. These are not the people of God. But God has, you see, helped them cultivate that relationship, or that relationship. And Hiram was able to say to Solomon, as he will, say, praise God. God not only have given this nation peace, which we saw earlier on in verse 4, but God has also given the right person at the right time to do the work. Because God has given Solomon with great wisdom. You see, you need people with talent to do the job. People with wisdom. And so that is what he says here. Blessed be the Lord this day, for he has given David a wise son over these great people. And so the condition was right. A leader was raised to do the job. And then next, right, the third thing we see here, again in chapter 5, verse 8, we are told here, then Hiram sent to Solomon, saying, I have considered the message which you sent me, and I will do all you desire concerning the cedar and the cypress log. Verse 9, my servant shall bring them down from Lebanon to the sea, and I will float them in the raft by sea to the place you indicate to me, and will have them broken apart there. Then you can take them away, and you shall fulfill my desire by giving food for my household. Now you see here, he received help from this pagan king, as he was. These pagan people, he said, yes, I heard your request, and we will give you what you want. All right, we will give you what you want, the logs, the woods, and whatever you want, and we will send it to you. Not only will send it to you, we will cut them nicely in pieces. He received the help. Now all this shows the providence of God, show how God put everything in place, shows to Solomon, as he will, it is God who, in a sense, behind the scene, in enabling Solomon and his people to build the temple, right? To build the temple. Without all this, it would have been impossible. Now let us therefore pause and ask ourselves, is it not true that God has given us peace? Never take peace in our country for granted. Maybe you see, that is to remind us that this is the time for us to build the temple, for us to build the church. Never think that, that this country will never go into war, right? Now, you see, in many countries, that is not possible, right? That is not possible. We know that there are persecutions in a great way. We know that it is difficult for people in Saudi Arabia and many of these other places to have the kind of freedom that we enjoy. So we have to ask ourselves, has not God given us the liberty, the freedom to worship and to share our faith for no reason? Yes, with a reason that we might build him, the church. And we look at this place that the Lord has brought us here. Even until this morning, as we were talking, right, we still could not believe it, that the Lord has brought us to this place. In fact, I just checked in the internet just last night, looking at the prices, the rental for this type of property, in Subang and PJ and this Sunway area. And even in the intermediate lot, right, the rental is about 1,700 to 2,000. And all the end lots, right, it's all 4,000 and above. Right? All the end lots are 4,000 and above. And the Lord has given us, right, a place for 2,000 a month. And the Lord has given us a place where its design is suitable for church use. So we have visited many around these places when we were looking for a property. None of the designs was suitable for church use. And this was not the property we were looking for. Right? The agent somehow brought us here. Right. Now you see, the Lord has given us peace in the land. The Lord has given us a place. And the Lord has given us people. Now we have people here, right? And I believe that it is not for no reason the Lord brought us together. Perhaps the Lord has a plan. Perhaps the Lord has a purpose for us. Now let us, like Solomon and the people, heed to God's command, all right, and God's purpose, and be obedient. Perhaps maybe the many opportunities the Lord might bring to our ways. All these are the Lord's doing. Are the Lord's doing. We must never claim any credit for ourselves in the building of the church. So it is God who builds His church. It is God who builds. Now, number two, right, the second reminder this morning is this. Wow, we can see very clearly in this account of temple construction that it was God who builds the temple. We are also reminded here that God uses us to build His church. It is God who builds His church, but God used us to build His church. Alright, so the fact that God is building His church does not mean that we do nothing. Yes, we see the emphasis in chapter 5. The Lord gave peace. The Lord has given David a wise son. And the Lord gave, right? You see that repeated, right? Many times in chapter 5. And yet, when we read chapter 5, we should be able to see that chapter 5 is filled with activities. It's filled with activities. In other words, Solomon understood this, right? He understood that while it is God who builds His church, we are not to be, idle. Right? He understood this. And therefore, you look at chapter 5, and there in verse 13, right? And in verse 13, we are told here, then King Solomon, before verse 13 is the Lord gave, the Lord gave, the Lord gave, right? Even until verse 12, it says, and so the Lord gave Solomon wisdom. So the emphasis is the Lord doing something in the first 12 verses. And then from verse 13 onward, what do we read? Verse 13, then Solomon raised up a labor force. Now you see, Solomon said, yes, Lord, you are the one who built, but I'm going to raise up a labor force. And so there's what is emphasized there. Out of all Israel, I'm going to, in other words, verse 13 means that Solomon now says, yes, God builds the church, now we will mobilize the people in the church to build the church. Is there a contradiction? It seems that there is a contradiction. But it's never so in the Bible, or never so in the Bible. And we must understand that about church building. All credit goes to God, but we must be mobilized to build the church of Jesus Christ. And so that's what verse 13 is about. He raised up a labor force out of all Israel, and the labor force was 30,000 men. It is a huge and massive temple construction project. It is a massive project. And may I remind you that although this is quite a massive project, right? This is quite a massive project, a lot of effort. And those who have been helping out the past few days, trying to get the place, ready and set up for today, a lot of work has gone in. Right? You can see people come every day, every day. See people here, in, out, every day, right? Sweating out. So it is a massive project. But let me tell you that the construction or the work of this physical place, of this physical building is nothing. It's nothing compared to the building up of the Church of Jesus Christ. Not talk about church building, but the Church of Jesus Christ, where we build up lives, where we bring the gospel out to the lost, and to bring them into the kingdom of God, and to disciple them and to build them up. Now that is even more massive, and that requires effort. We need more people. We need to mobilize the labor force to go out into all the world and make disciples of all the nations, and to baptize them and to teach them all that Jesus Christ has commanded them. And that is no small task. That is no small task. And so that is what temple work or church work is about. We need 30,000 men. And then verse 14, he sends them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shift. They were 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Can you see what is going on here in these verses? That there is this mobilization of labor force. There is sending of people to this place to work and taking shift work, doing shift work as they will 10,000 here and so on. Now you see the description here. And so it says, and 2 months at home, and Adoniram was in charge of the labor force. Verse 15, and Solomon had 70,000 who carried burdens, and 80,000 who quarried stones in the mountains. Beside verse 16, 3,300 from the chief of Solomon's deputies who supervised the people who labor in the work. Can you see the repetition of labor force in verse 13, labor force in verse 14, and the word labor there in these verses? It is labor, it is hard work, it is mobilization of thousands and tens of thousands of people. A lot. We need more people. That's what Solomon is saying. We need everyone to chip in. No one should be idle, because the work is great. And they all understood that. You see, imagine the people, they were building a massive temple complex, as they will, and they all knew that we need all the manpower. Let none of us think that only a few people do, that's good enough, right? The rest of us can relax. None of us should relax. And the people there understood it, and we must understand that. We must understand that. We need thousands and thousands of people. Because there is stones to be quarried, like verse 17, and the kings commanded them to quarry large stones, costly stones, and hewn stones to lay the foundation of the temple. All these are hard work. Go and quarry stones. You see, we have never done that before. We don't know how hard it is. But let me assure you, these are hard works. Church work is hard work. And that is the lesson here. And so in verse 18, so Solomon's builders, Hiram's builders, and the Jebelitites quarried them, and they prepared timber and stones to build the temple. Solomon's people, the thousands, tens of thousands. Hiram's people, builders, or they call them builders. In fact, that's how Jesus referred us, right? How Jesus referred to us. We are builders. We are builders. And that is what Jesus is saying. That's what Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 9. In Matthew chapter 9. And this is a well-known text here. But if you have not memorized these verses or even known of these verses, now let me refer you to these verses here. And here's this reminder from the Lord Jesus Christ about the need of temple construction or church construction. Matthew chapter 9, verse 35. And Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in the synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, healing every sickness and every disease among the people. And verse 36, but when he saw the crowds, when he saw the multitudes, I'm not sure when was the last time you saw a crowd and you saw them the way Jesus saw a crowd. When you are at school, about 12:30 or 12:35, when the students, being released from school, and you see them rushing out of the school gate, running to their parents or to the different car, you see multitudes. Or in the campus, you see students, and you see multitudes of people. What do you see when you see multitudes? Let me tell you what Jesus saw. He says here, when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them because they were weary and scattered like sheep having no shepherds. When Jesus saw multitudes, when he saw crowds of people, Jesus was moved with compassion These are lost people. These are people who need the gospel of Jesus Christ. These are people without Christ. They will be lost forever and ever. Jesus saw them with a different eye. And he was moved, I believe, perhaps to tears. And then he said, verse 37, then he said to his disciples, the harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. You see the word that Jesus uses here? The laborers. That is the word that we saw earlier on in 1 Kings chapter 5. Labor force. Builders. Solomon's builders. Hiram's builders. Or Solomon's workers. Now you see, that is what we need when there is a work to be done. We need workers. We need laborers. We need builders. So that's what Jesus said. The harvest is truly plentiful, but the workers or the laborers are few. Therefore, verse 38, pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into the harvest. Pray that God might raise up a labor force to build the church of Jesus Christ. Because the work is immense. Multitudes and the crowds is a huge crowd. Therefore, when Jesus, in another portion of scripture in John chapter 4 and verse 35, he has the same reminder for his disciples. John chapter 4 and verse 35. Now listen to this verse. Jesus said, do not say there are still 4 months and then comes the harvest. Oh, there are people. Jesus perhaps can hear the people saying, oh Lord, you know that it's not yet ripe, right? It's not ripe yet. Jesus says, do not say that. Do not say that there are still 4 months, then comes the harvest. Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the field, for they are ready, white for harvest. The reason why you don't see a harvest, the reason why you don't see that the work is massive, is because you are not lifting up your eye. You are not opening up your eye to see the needs out there. The needs are everywhere. People are dying every day. People are lost into eternity every day. Do we have eyes to see that every day, in fact, second by second, people are just disappearing from this earth and disappearing into eternal damnation? Lift up your eyes, Jesus said. Don't say that we still have much time, for the harvest, right, is ready, is plentiful. And that is what we should see, what we should be reminded of as we read 1 Kings chapter 5, as we read of these people building the temple in the Old Testament, and we see them. If you have a motion, as it were, a picture of these people working, you see thousands of people everywhere carrying log, quarrying stones, laying foundations, patching up this place and doing up that place. Everyone was active, busy, and that is how the church should look like. That's what we should be. We should be like. That every one of us should be doing something, busy with this and that, building up the church of Jesus Christ. Now you see, when we read 1 Kings chapter 5, and when we come to, in fact, chapter 6, and we come to the end of chapter 6 and verse 38, we read here that in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, and the house was finished. Oh, the joy. I'm sure, last night, as you're getting this place ready, oh, the joy when someone finally was able to take pictures of the completed product, right, and send out pictures. They say, it's finished. It's done. Tomorrow you can come. You can come and you can worship here in this place. It's ready. It's finished. And you can imagine, that is the picture there. Of course, Solomon didn't have cameras, right? He couldn't take picture of the temple and say, it's finished. Beautiful temple. But while Solomon has finished building his temple, our job is not done yet. Right? the business of building the church is not finished yet. Right? The building is finished, right? But the building of the Church of Jesus Christ is still an ongoing project. And so these are the reminders. Number one, it is God who builds His church. And number two, God builds His church by using us. Right? He uses human means to build His church. And that leads us to the third thing that we should take note of in these chapters about temple building. And this is very important. Number three, we want to ask, why is God building His temple? Why did God build His temple? Why is God building His church? Why are we doing all these things? Why are we spending all the money and the energy, and why are we doing all these things? It must not be to make a name for ourselves. GRC, Grace Reformed Church. We are going to make a name for ourselves. We are going to make sure we have a nice design. We're going to advertise. We're going to publicize. We're going to make people know us. It must not be to make a name for ourselves, and it must not be because we want to compete with others. We are here, new kid on the block, but we are going to be a real kid. The reason is this. 1 Kings chapter 5 and verse 5. 1 Kings chapter 5 and verse 5. It says here, and behold, I propose to build a house for the name of the Lord. I propose to build for the name of the Lord. My God, as the Lord has spoken to my father, David said, your son whom I will set on your throne in your place, he shall build the house for my name. Now that is the reason that Solomon should build a temple, not for himself, not for Israel, but for God. In fact, that was already pointed out in 1 Chronicles chapter 29, when instructions was given about temple building. 1 Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 1, it says here, furthermore, King David said to all the assembly, now here's David telling the people, he said to all the assembly, my son Solomon, whom alone God has chosen, is young and inexperienced, and the work is great, because the temple is not for men, but for the Lord. So David already reminded, and Solomon, of course, probably heard that. Say, your father said that you're going to build a temple, but it's not for you, it's for the Lord. And so David already told all the people, my son is going to build, but it's not for men. The church is not for men. That is the reason. That's the reason for temple construction. That's the reason why we are putting in all the effort and all the energy and all the money and all the time and whatever we have to build the church of Jesus Christ, because we are building it for God. Put in another way, why does the church even exist? Why do we even want a church? What's the reason for having a church? You see, the problem is that people think that the church exists for the people. We think that we are the reason why there is a church. And that's the reason why people talk about people-friendly churches. That's why people, talks about being the people as the focus. Talking about building the church that the people want. But if we build, if our purpose to build a church is for God, then we are not building a church that people want. We will be building a church that God wants. The church is for the name of the Lord. If that is our goal, if that is our reason for church construction. Now, what should be our motivation? Should be our motivation? Now, it should be this. You see, you go on to chapter 6, 1 Kings, and verse 2. Now that Solomon understands, right, the purpose of this whole enterprise, of this whole building project, is for God and for His glory alone. Now, if that is the reason, then what is our motivation? What how does it influence the way we do church? Now, there is a connection. If that is our purpose, then that should influence the way we do church. If people are the focus, then the way we do church is people is always right, customer is always right. There will always be a seeker-sensitive church. But if God is the reason, now look at verse 2 of chapter 6. Now the house which King Solomon built for the Lord, there is the reason, which Solomon built for the Lord, its length was 60 cubits, its width 20, and its height 30 cubits. Now you cross-reference this, right, to 2 Chronicles and chapter 2, right? 2 Chronicles chapter 2. Now you look at verses 4 and 5. 2 Chronicles chapter 2 verses 4 and 5. And it says here, Behold, I am building a temple for the name of the Lord my God. That this constant repetition to remind Solomon, reminding himself and the people that we are building this, we are doing all this for God's sake. And so it says here, Chronicles is the parallel account, right? And it says, Behold, I'm building a temple for the name of the Lord my God, to dedicate it to Him, to burn before Him sweet incense, for the continual showbread, for the burnt offering, morning and evening, on the Sabbath, on the new moon, on the set feast of the Lord our God. This is an ordinance forever to Israel. Verse 5, And the temple which I will build will be great, for our God is greater than all gods. Now what these two verses and earlier on in chapter 6 and verse 2 is saying is this. Now Solomon knows that he may not do church as he likes. Because when you read chapter 6, I think it was a long chapter just now when you were reading it, right? Now you see that chapter 6, Solomon was following careful instruction as to what the temple should be like. And that's why all this calculation, that its length was 60 cubits, its width was 20 cubits, its height is 30 cubits. In fact, you can kind of just read on, right? Kind of read on, and you can see all those instructions given there in chapter 6. You read, for example, in verse 21. So these are the implications. That means we are supposed not to do church our ways. We are to do church God's way. In other words, we have to go back to the Word of God. Just as Solomon going to the blueprint, God's blueprint for the temple. How big, how high, how wide, and what kind of materials. You see all the materials mentioned there. What kind of materials should be used? Now, if that is to be the case, what then are the implications for us? Now, two things I list here. Now, look at chapter 6, 1 Kings chapter 6. We see verse 21 and 22, right? Verses 21 and 22. It says here, So Solomon overlaid the inside of the temple with pure gold, and stretched gold chains across the front of the inner sanctuary, and overlaid it with gold. Verse 22, the whole temple he overlaid with gold, until he had finished all the temple. Also he overlaid with gold the entire altar that was by the inner sanctuary. Can you see the word gold being repeatedly mentioned in these two verses? In other words, the implication is this: if temple building is for God's glory, then we have to give our best. We must not have this shoddy work. We must not cut corners in doing church work. we give to God our best in terms of our resources, in terms of things, our best in terms of our efforts, our best in terms of our time, our best in terms of our years. When I say our years means, here's a reminder for young people, that you have to give of your best to the Master. And perhaps at the prime of your life, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Give of your best. Don't say, wait till I retire, then I'll serve God. Give your best years to God. Give your best years to God. Give your best effort to God. That is the implication, the practical implication. If church work is for the glory of God, then we give our all and our best to Him. But the second implication, is that we cannot build, as I say, as we like. We cannot build as we like. What kind of a church do we want to build? Who should lead the church? How do we worship in the church? Now, there are many discussions these days about whether we can have gay pastors. If church is for God, we know the answer. If church is about ourselves, we will have a different answer. Can we have women pastors? Oh, never mind what the Bible says. We will decide who leads the church, how church is to be done. No, we don't decide. We don't decide. Church is for God. Like Solomon, we open up the God's blueprint and we follow exactly as we have been instructed in building the Church of Jesus Christ. How do we worship? Do we worship as we like? Has not the Bible any teaching about how we should approach God? Now you see, these then are the implications. We don't do as we like, and we give off our best to our Master. This is temple building. It is not about the physical. This is temple, or church building, because we are building lives. We are doing gospel work. It is God who built His church, but God uses us. And the whole purpose of us doing this is for His glory. Let us pray.